Some European leaders are signaling interest in dialogue with Moscow, and Berlin is now part of that conversation, according to recent reports. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has described Russia as a European country and voiced hope for a rebalancing of EU-Russia ties, according to Reuters, reporting on his recent remarks. The comments are sparking debate inside the EU about how to handle any future talks with Moscow, observers note. Some commentators frame this as a shift in tone, but Berlin's broader policy on Ukraine and sanctions remains unchanged in public reporting as of this broadcast. State media in Russia attributed quotes to Merz about finding a balance with Russia. Reuters has also reported his call for rebalancing ties. According to these reports, Merz stated that if peace is achieved and relations stabilized, Europe could look ahead with great confidence beyond 2026. And if we can then still manage to ensure that peace and freedom return to Europe, that we finally find a balance once again with our largest European neighbor, namely Russia, Merz stated, according to reports covering his speech. The wording can be read as support for eventual engagement, but it doesn't confirm a concrete policy change at this stage. This is my wish for us. I am confident that it will succeed. Please contribute to its success. I wish you and all of us a very good year 2026, Merz stated, according to reports. The language suggests interest in normalized relations, though specifics remain unclear. Merz also emphasized that Russia is a European country, according to reports, a framing that positions Moscow as a neighbor requiring engagement rather than permanent isolation from the European community. And I'm not saying this because I'm here in the East. I say this in every other place in Germany, too. Russia is a European country, Merz stated, according to reports covering his comments. The deliberate emphasis suggests a calculated effort to reframe the relationship in geographical and cultural terms. Many EU officials have focused on deterrence and sanctions since 2022, though messaging varies by capital, observers note. Some have maintained hardline positions, while others have periodically signaled openness to eventual dialogue under certain conditions. By emphasizing Russia's European identity, Merz appears to be laying rhetorical groundwork for eventual normalization, suggesting that geographic and historical ties could potentially overcome current political divisions, according to some interpretations of his remarks. The framing also carries historical weight, observers note. Germany has long maintained significant economic ties with Russia, particularly in the energy sector, and the relationship between Berlin and Moscow has historically been viewed as central to European stability, according to analysts studying European diplomatic history. The words mark a notable change from Merz's position last summer when he reportedly dismissed direct contact with Moscow as pointless, according to reports on his earlier stance. At the time, he said he would refrain from calling President Putin, signaling an approach that mirrored Brussels' dominant view. Now that tone appears to be softening, observers note. Several leaders have complained Europe is not at the center of U.S.-led peace efforts, according to Reuters reporting on European frustrations with current diplomatic arrangements. The evolution in Merz's public comments reflects broader discussions occurring across European capitals, analysts suggest. Some leaders who initially supported maximum pressure on Russia are now discussing whether isolation alone can achieve European objectives. Some observers attribute these discussions to recognition that the conflict has reached a difficult phase, making diplomatic solutions more attractive to some policymakers. Others point to economic pressures from prolonged sanctions and energy disruptions that have affected European economies significantly over the past years. The German economy in particular has faced challenges related to energy transition and industrial competitiveness, according to economic reports. These pressures may influence political calculations about the sustainability of current policies. Some analysts suggest, though others argue, economic concerns should not drive security policy. Since February 2022, most EU member states have pursued a strategy of isolating Russia following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to the established policy framework. That approach has drawn criticism from some European leaders who feel Brussels has been left out of peace talks. U.S.-led efforts are driving the latest talks, and European leaders have publicly voiced frustration about being left out, according to multiple reports. As Washington took the diplomatic lead, Europe found itself in a supporting role, politically aligned with Ukraine, but not directly at the negotiating table. The European Union's diminished role in peace negotiations has become a source of concern for some leaders across the bloc, according to observers tracking the diplomatic dynamics. While Brussels maintained its isolation policy, the United States moved forward with direct engagement. This situation has reportedly frustrated European capitals seeking greater influence over outcomes that will directly affect the continent's security architecture, analysts note. The result has been growing discussion among EU leadership about how to approach Moscow going forward. The tension between maintaining unity on sanctions and isolation versus pursuing pragmatic engagement has become a topic of debate, observers suggest. Merz's comments appear to reflect these internal discussions building across European capitals. Some European diplomats have privately expressed concern that the continent could be presented with a fait accompli, a peace settlement negotiated without significant European input that nonetheless shapes European security for decades, according to reports citing unnamed officials. Merz is not alone in discussing potential dialogue. Commission spokesperson Paula Pinho said direct talks with Putin may be needed at some point, while adding, "We're not there yet," according to reports on her remarks. Unfortunately, we're not seeing any signs from President Putin to be engaging in such talks, so we're not there yet. But at some point, we would hope indeed that there will be some such talks that will finally lead to peace in Ukraine, Pinho stated, according to reports. The acknowledgement that direct engagement with Putin may eventually be necessary represents a notable comment from Brussels, analysts observe. While stopping short of advocating immediate outreach, the statement opens discussion about diplomatic space that was previously less publicly addressed. The comments suggest recognition within EU institutions that permanent isolation may face practical challenges as a long-term strategy, particularly if peace negotiations advance without European participation, observers note. The Commission statement also reflects the institutional complexity of EU foreign policy, analysts observe. While the Commission can express views, actual policy requires consensus among member states, many of whom hold significantly different positions on engagement with Moscow. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron said Europe may need to re-engage in direct talks with Putin if U.S. efforts don't produce results, Reuters reported. Macron indicated it would once again become useful to speak directly with Vladimir Putin, signaling a pragmatic approach. "I think it will become useful again to talk to Vladimir Putin. Yes. In any case, I noticed that there are people speaking with Vladimir Putin," Macron stated, according to reports. So, I personally believe that we Europeans and Ukrainians, it's in our interest to find the right framework to properly re-engage this discussion. The French president's reference to others already speaking with Putin appears directed at Washington's direct engagement, analysts observe. Macron seems to be arguing that European absence from these conversations represents a concern for European interests. Macron has historically positioned himself as Europe's most active diplomatic voice, having maintained channels with various leaders even during periods of tension, observers note. His current comments continue that approach. The French position also reflects Paris's traditional emphasis on European strategic autonomy, analysts note. France has long advocated for Europe to develop independent diplomatic and defense capabilities, and the current situation, where Washington leads negotiations affecting European security, reinforces those arguments for some French policymakers. Macron criticized the current diplomatic arrangement where Europeans talk among ourselves with negotiators who go alone to discuss with the Russians, calling the situation not optimal, according to his reported remarks. Otherwise, we talk among ourselves with negotiators who go alone to discuss with the Russians. This is not optimal, Macron stated, according to reports. The characterization suggests the French president views current arrangements as inadequate for European interests. If a robust, lasting peace with all the required guarantees can be achieved, that's great. And in any case, we will then sit down at the table with everyone, Macron stated, according to reports. The comment suggests France expects to participate in settlement discussions. It will also be essential in the coming weeks to find the ways and means for Europeans in good organization to re-engage in a full dialogue with Russia in complete transparency and in association with Ukraine, Macron stated, according to reports. The emphasis on organization and transparency suggests awareness of coordination challenges. Macron's insistence on coordination in association with Ukraine is notable, analysts observe. It suggests the French president is aware of concerns that European outreach to Moscow could undermine Kiev's position if not carefully managed. Italy has now added its voice to discussions about engagement. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni publicly backed the idea of European dialogue with Russia, stating that the time has come for Europe to also speak with Russia, according to her reported statements. I believe the time has come for Europe to also speak with Russia, because if Europe decides to be part of this phase of negotiations by speaking only to one of the two sides involved, I fear that in the end it will see that the positive contribution it can make is limited, Meloni stated, according to reports. The Italian Prime Minister's comments represent support for the emerging discussion about engagement, analysts observe. Italy's position adds to calls from Berlin and Paris for considering dialogue options. Berlin, Paris, and Rome have all discussed dialogue, but there is no single EU line yet, observers note. Different capitals maintain different positions on timing, conditions, and approach to any potential engagement with Moscow. Meloni's support for dialogue is particularly notable given her political background, some analysts suggest. Her coalition includes parties with varying views on Russia, and her own position has evolved since taking office, according to observers tracking Italian politics. However, the Italian Prime Minister acknowledged the risks of disorganized outreach, warning that proceeding without coordination would be doing a favor to Putin, according to her remarks. And the last thing I want to do in life is a favor to Putin, she stated, according to reports. Meloni identified what she sees as the core challenge facing European diplomacy. The issue is who should do it. Because if we made the mistake of deciding on one hand to reopen dialogues with Russia and on the other hand to proceed in a disorganized manner while doing so, we would be doing a favor to Putin. The warning reflects awareness that Moscow could potentially exploit divisions among European capitals, analysts observe. Coordinated engagement would be essential to maintain leverage in any future discussions. We have had this problem since the beginning of the negotiations. There are many voices speaking. There are many formats that exist, Meloni stated, according to reports. The acknowledgement suggests recognition that coordination challenges have affected European influence. Moscow has historically proven adept at bilateral diplomacy with individual European states, potentially gaining concessions from one capital that others might not support. Analysts studying Russian diplomatic strategy observe. This pattern reinforces the importance of coordination that Meloni emphasized. Meloni also proposed appointing a dedicated EU special envoy for Ukraine, aiming to strengthen the bloc's role in any negotiations and address the coordination problems she identified, according to her reported statements. It is the reason why I have always been in favor of the appointment of a special envoy for Europe on the Ukrainian issue. That is a person who would allow us to synthesize and speak with one voice, Meloni stated, according to reports covering her proposal. This is the real issue that puts us in difficulty, she stated, according to reports. The proposal aims to address structural challenges in European foreign policy coordination that have been highlighted by the conflict. Whether such an appointment could overcome the challenges of coordinating 27 member states with diverse interests remains uncertain, observers note. However, the proposal represents a concrete suggestion toward institutional solutions. The EU has previously appointed special representatives for various regions and issues, with mixed results depending on the mandate and political support provided. Analysts familiar with EU institutional structures observe. The effectiveness of any Ukraine envoy would depend significantly on the authority and resources granted. On the question of Russia potentially rejoining the G7, from which it was excluded following events in Crimea in 2014, Meloni was notably more cautious than on the question of bilateral dialogue. Today, it would seem to me that the entry of Russia into the G7, for example, is impossible, she stated, according to reports. The distinction between bilateral dialogue and multilateral rehabilitation suggests a measured approach. These are all topics that will arise when and if there is peace, and I repeat, also based on how it is achieved and under what conditions it is achieved, Maloney stated, according to reports. So for now, it seems absolutely premature to me, Maloney stated, according to reports. The comment indicates that while dialogue may be discussed, fundamental changes to Russia's international status would require peace and specific conditions. The distinction between tactical dialogue and strategic rehabilitation is important, analysts observe. European leaders appear to be separating the question of communication channels from broader questions about Russia's place in international institutions. The Kremlin has taken note of the shifting European tone. Russian media quoted spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirming that President Putin remains open to dialogue with European counterparts, according to those reports. The Russian response suggests cautious openness to European outreach while setting parameters for acceptable dialogue. Analysts interpreting Moscow's messaging observe. Russia appears to be testing whether the shift in European rhetoric will translate into substantive policy changes. However, Peskov issued conditions for such engagement, according to Russian media reports. The Kremlin spokesman indicated that talks must focus on understanding each other's positions rather than what Moscow characterizes as lectures. The Kremlin's response indicates willingness to engage, but on terms Russia considers acceptable, analysts note. Moscow appears to be signaling that European outreach would need to acknowledge Russian perspectives. Russian state media has amplified European statements about dialogue, framing them as validation of Moscow's position that isolation is unsustainable, observers tracking Russian media note. This coverage serves domestic and international messaging purposes for the Kremlin. Russian media quoted Peskov saying dialogue should be about understanding positions and not lecturing, a framing Moscow often uses when discussing potential Western engagement, according to those reports. The condition presents European leaders with a balancing act, observers note. They must reconcile domestic political pressures regarding accountability for Russian actions with Moscow's stated preference for what it views as respectful dialogue. Some analysts suggest the Kremlin's response is designed to test European unity, potentially seeking to identify differences between capitals discussing engagement and those favoring continued isolation. Moscow has historically sought to leverage European divisions. The coming weeks will reveal whether the discussions in Berlin, Paris, and Rome translate into concrete diplomatic initiatives, or whether domestic political constraints and alliance commitments limit actual policy changes. The no lectures framing also reflects long-standing Russian complaints about Western diplomatic approaches, analysts note. Moscow has consistently characterized Western engagement as condescending, using this framing to justify its own positions and appeal to domestic audiences. The emerging discussions about dialogue expose questions about Europe's role, relevance, and strategy as the Ukraine conflict continues, analysts observe. The bloc faces competing considerations that different capitals weigh differently. On one hand, maintaining isolation demonstrates solidarity with Ukraine and upholds the principle that territorial aggression should have consequences, supporters of the current policy argue. Changing course could risk undermining the sanctions regime. On the other hand, remaining absent from negotiations could produce outcomes that don't fully account for European security interests, proponents of engagement contend. If peace terms are set without European input, the continent may face consequences it had limited role in shaping. The debate reflects broader discussions within the transatlantic alliance, as European capitals assess their strategic positions and consider various foreign policy approaches, observers note. Some European leaders have expressed frustration with what they perceive as limited consultation in U.S.-led negotiations, analysts note. This sentiment has contributed to calls for more independent European diplomatic action. Not all European capitals share the openness to dialogue expressed by Berlin, Paris, and Rome, observers note. Eastern European countries, particularly the Baltic states and Poland, have consistently advocated for maintaining maximum pressure on Russia. These countries, which share borders with Russia or have historical experience of Soviet occupation, view engagement discussions with significant concern, according to reports on their positions. For them, any perceived softening toward Moscow raises questions about European commitment to their security. The divergence between Western and Eastern European positions on Russia policy has been a recurring challenge for EU unity, analysts observe. The current discussions about dialogue may intensify these tensions within the bloc. Polish officials have previously warned against premature engagement with Moscow, arguing that any dialogue must come from a position of strength and with clear conditions, according to reports on Polish foreign policy positions. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have similarly maintained that Russia must demonstrate genuine commitment to peace before any normalization can be considered, according to reports on their positions. Ukraine is watching the European debate about dialogue with concern, according to reports citing Ukrainian officials. Kiev has consistently emphasized the importance of maintaining international pressure on Russia and has expressed concern about any moves that could weaken that pressure. Ukrainian officials have stated that any peace negotiations must include Ukraine as a central participant, not as a subject of discussions between outside powers, according to reports on Ukrainian positions. This concern applies to both U.S.-led and any potential European-led engagement with Moscow. The emphasis by Macron and Meloni on coordinating with Ukraine reflects awareness of these concerns, analysts observe. However, the practical implementation of such coordination remains to be defined. Ukraine's position has been that peace must be just and sustainable, not simply an end to fighting that rewards aggression, according to official Ukrainian statements. European dialogue with Moscow that doesn't prioritize these principles could strain relations with Kiev. The discussions about dialogue occur against the backdrop of broader European debates about strategic autonomy and the continent's role in a changing international order, analysts observe. These discussions predated the Ukraine conflict but have continued since 2022. Some European leaders argue that heavy reliance on American diplomatic leadership leaves the continent vulnerable to shifts in U.S. policy, observers note. The current situation where Washington leads negotiations affecting European security illustrates this concern for some policymakers. Others maintain that European security remains connected to the transatlantic alliance and that pursuing divergent positions could create complications, analysts suggest. Different capitals weigh these considerations differently. Merz's statement about Russia being a European country can be read as emphasizing European agency in managing regional relationships, analysts suggest. The framing positions Europe as having natural interests in its eastern neighborhood. The sanctions regime imposed on Russia since 2022 faces ongoing questions about long-term sustainability, analysts observe. European economies have absorbed costs, creating domestic political pressures that policymakers must address. The debate about strategic autonomy also encompasses questions about European defense capabilities and the continent's ability to provide security guarantees independent of the United States, observers note. These broader questions inform the specific debate about dialogue with Moscow. Meloni's warning about disorganized engagement highlights a persistent challenge facing European diplomacy, analysts observe. Without coordination, different national approaches could potentially undermine collective leverage. If we made the mistake of deciding on one hand to reopen dialogues with Russia, and on the other hand to proceed in a disorganized manner while doing so, we would be doing a favor to Putin, Meloni stated, according to reports. The concern reflects Europe's historical challenge of coordinating foreign policy across multiple capitals, observers note. Different national interests, historical relationships, and economic considerations have complicated unified positioning on major issues. The EU's institutional structure, which requires consensus on foreign policy, can make rapid adaptation to changing circumstances difficult, analysts observe. Individual member states may move at different speeds than collective institutions. Whether the proposed special envoy or other coordination mechanisms could address these structural challenges remains to be seen, analysts suggest. The stakes of fragmented approaches, both for European credibility and for Ukraine, are significant. The challenge is compounded by the speed of diplomatic developments, observers note. U.S.-led negotiations are proceeding on their own timeline, and Europe may need to adapt quickly to remain relevant, a capability that EU institutions have historically struggled to demonstrate. The diplomatic discussions occur as the Ukraine conflict continues through what many observers consider a challenging phase. Military dynamics, economic pressures, and political developments are all factors that could influence the conflict's trajectory. Negotiations led by the United States have reportedly made some progress, though details remain limited, according to various reports. The prospect of eventual settlement discussions has prompted European leaders to consider their role in both the process and potential aftermath. Ukraine's position in any settlement will be significantly influenced by the support and guarantees it receives from international partners, analysts observe. European involvement in negotiations could affect outcomes. European leaders appear to be calculating that engagement in diplomatic discussions could position them to influence outcomes, while continued absence leaves them dependent on decisions made elsewhere, analysts suggest. The humanitarian dimension of the conflict also weighs on European considerations, observers note. The continent has absorbed millions of Ukrainian refugees, and the economic and social costs of continued conflict affect European societies directly. The discussions in Berlin, Paris, and Rome suggest the isolation-first approach is facing questions it hasn't faced since implementation, analysts observe. While no major leader has called for abandoning sanctions or reducing support for Ukraine, the rhetorical discussions about potential dialogue are notable. Some analysts argue the discussions reflect pragmatic consideration of whether isolation alone has achieved stated objectives and whether complementary approaches deserve discussion. Others warn that any perceived softening toward Moscow could create complications for European unity. Europe finds itself at an important point in discussions about its approach to Russia and the Ukraine conflict. The comments from Merz, Macron, and Meloni signal that questions about engagement are being raised more openly, though the ultimate direction of policy remains to be determined. The discussions expose fundamental questions about European strategic autonomy, alliance relationships, and the bloc's capacity to influence outcomes in its neighborhood, analysts observe. How these questions are addressed will shape European security considerations for years to come. For now, discussions about potential dialogue coexist with continued support for Ukraine and maintenance of sanctions on Russia. Whether this represents an evolving approach or temporary discussions that yield to continued current policy will become clearer as events develop. What is clear is that Europe's role in addressing the conflict and its relationships with both Washington and Moscow is being actively discussed at the highest levels. The outcome of these discussions will have implications for the continent's future beyond 2026, as Chancellor Merz suggested. The divergence between Western European capitals discussing dialogue and Eastern European capitals emphasizing continued pressure represents a significant challenge for EU unity. Observers note, managing this tension will be essential for maintaining European effectiveness. The world watches as Europe navigates these considerations, seeking approaches that protect its interests, maintain its values, and contribute to durable peace on its eastern border. The stakes are significant, and the path forward remains subject to ongoing deliberation across the continent's capitals.